My name is Robert. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, dependable, quiet, the guy who shows up early, leaves late, and doesn't make a show of it. I work in a technical role, one of those positions that only gets noticed when something breaks. And outside of work, I'm fairly ordinary. I live alone. I run a few times a week. I call my mother every Sunday. Nothing about me signals drama. If you asked the people I worked with back then how they saw me, they would probably say I was calm under pressure. Or maybe they'd say I was built for stress. Some might admit, if they were being honest, that I was easy to overlook. Not weak, just there, useful, present, replaceable in theory, even if not in practice. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. And it definitely isn't about making anyone look like a villain. It's about what happens when responsibility quietly piles up, when silence gets mistaken for consent, and when your body becomes the only thing left that's willing to tell the truth. A few years ago, I collapsed at work after 14 consecutive days on call. No warning, no dramatic build-up. One moment I was standing, answering yet another alert, and the next I was on the floor with fluorescent lights blurring above me. That incident triggered an HR investigation, not into the workload, not into staffing decisions, but into me. Almost overnight, my health report became a performance issue. Words like resilience and capacity and fit started appearing in emails where my name used to be enough. What follows is the long version of how that happened. Not just the collapse, but everything leading up to it, and everything that changed after. This is a story about being underestimated in small, invisible ways. About learning how systems respond when the quiet person finally stops absorbing the impact. About discovering leverage not through aggression, but through patience, documentation, and restraint. I'm telling it now because time has given me distance. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not trying to justify myself. I don't even need anyone involved to hear this. I'm sharing it because I know how common this pattern is, and how rarely it gets named from the inside. If you're expecting explosive confrontations or dramatic speeches, this won't be that. Most of what mattered happened internally, or on paper, or in rooms where voices stayed low. The changes were subtle at first, almost polite, and by the time anyone realized what was shifting, it was already irreversible. I'll walk you through who I was to them, how that role formed, and what it cost me to stay in it. I'll also tell you who I am now, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as a record. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever felt your body breaking under a pressure everyone else seemed to think you were built to carry? If you looked at the org chart, I was a senior engineer. Solid title, mid-level authority. On paper, I had influence. In reality, I occupied a very specific space in people's minds, one that didn't come with visibility or voice. I was the guy you tagged when something went wrong at 2:13 a.m. The name you added to the thread when no one else replied. The calm presence in outages, the steady tone on bridges, the one who didn't panic. But I wasn't the guy you asked how he was doing. In meetings, I spoke when I had something precise to add. I didn't dominate conversations. I didn't repeat myself louder if I wasn't heard. I assumed, incorrectly as it turns out, that clarity would carry its own weight. When ideas I introduced quietly resurfaced later in someone else's voice, I noticed, but I didn't correct it. It didn't seem worth the friction. That pattern defined me more than any performance review ever did. Managers described me as reliable. Peers called me rock solid. Those words sound like compliments, and maybe they were meant to be. But they also came with an unspoken expectation. Rocks don't move. Rocks don't complain. Rocks absorb pressure, so other things don't have to. When on-call schedules were tight, my name filled the gaps. When coverage fell through, I didn't mind. When new systems rolled out without documentation, I figured them out quietly and made them stable. Over time, people stopped asking if I could take more. They assumed I could. I didn't see myself as invisible back then. I saw myself as a professional. I believed that being steady was a form of leadership, that if I kept my head down and did excellent work, it would eventually be recognized in the ways that mattered: scope, support, balance. I told myself that loudness was a different personality type, not a requirement for influence. What I didn't realize was that silence, once noticed, gets categorized. I became low risk, low maintenance, always fine. Those labels travel faster than the truth. When someone else pushed back on unreasonable hours, it was framed as advocacy. When I stayed late without comment, it was framed as capacity. My willingness to endure quietly became evidence that the system worked. I remember a manager once saying, half joking, "If everyone handled stress like Robert, we'd have no problems here." People laughed. I smiled. That sentence lodged somewhere deep, though I didn't know why at the time. The truth is, I was managing stress by internalizing it, by compressing it into routines, by telling myself that discomfort was temporary and competence was permanent. I didn't share much about my personal life at work, not because I was secretive, but because no one asked. When you're not asked long enough, you start editing yourself preemptively. You become efficient even with your own needs. Looking back, I can see how cleanly I fit into the role they had for me. The dependable one, the absorber, the background stabilizer. It wasn't malicious, it was convenient. Systems don't exploit people loudly. They reward the ones who don't interrupt them. And I didn't interrupt anything. Not the workload, not the expectations, not the slow erosion of boundaries. I thought I was choosing professionalism. I didn't realize I was volunteering for invisibility. At that stage of my life, if you'd asked me whether I felt respected, I would have said yes, without hesitation, because respect to me meant being trusted to handle things. It didn't yet mean being protected from them. That distinction would come later, much later. The first moment that stayed with me didn't feel important at the time. That's probably why it worked. It was a scheduling meeting, short, functional, the kind where everyone pretends the decisions are temporary, even though they never are. A new on-call rotation was being discussed. One engineer had just transferred teams. Another had requested fewer nights because of a newborn. A third was starting a certification program. The manager scrolled through the calendar, paused, and said almost casually, "We'll just add Robert here. He's flexible." No one looked at me when he said it. Not to check, not to confirm. It wasn't framed as a question. I opened my mouth, then closed it. In my head, I did the math. One extra weekend, a few more nights. I was already used to it. I didn't have kids. I didn't have visible obligations. Saying no would slow the meeting down. It would require explanation. And I told myself, honestly, that I could handle it. So I nodded. The meeting moved on. That was the first small cut. Not the extra work itself, but the assumption embedded inside it, the quiet certainty that my time was more available than others, that my capacity was elastic, that I didn't need to be consulted. What made it subtle was how reasonable it all sounded. Afterward, a coworker caught up with me near the elevators and said, "Hey, thanks for covering that. You're a lifesaver." I smiled and said, "No problem." And I meant it, at least I thought I did. What I didn't realize was that something had shifted, not in policy, but in perception. A line had been crossed, gently, with no resistance. Once that happens, the line becomes hypothetical. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Small, polite, almost invisible. A late night alert that could have waited until morning routed to me because I was already on. A weekend deployment was scheduled without checking because Robert's usually around. A Slack message that started with, "Quick question, sorry, I know it's late," was sent well past midnight. Each time I responded quickly, calmly, professionally. Each time I reinforced the same idea. The thing about being reliable is that people stop distinguishing between reliability and availability. One is a skill, the other is a resource. And resources, once identified, get optimized. I didn't talk about the toll because it didn't feel dramatic enough to justify a conversation. I wasn't collapsing. I wasn't failing. I was just tired, a little more each day. And tiredness, especially in high-performance environments, is treated like background noise. Everyone has it, so it doesn't count. There was one afternoon, I remember it clearly, when I mentioned almost offhandedly that The on-call load had been heavy lately. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't ask for changes. I just stated it. The response was immediate and dismissive, though not unkind. "Well, you handle it really well," someone said. "I'd be a mess." People laughed. The moment passed. That was the second cut, because what I heard wasn't praise, it was an instruction. Handle it well. Keep being the example. Don't complicate things. From that point on, I stopped mentioning it altogether. Not consciously, it just felt inefficient. There was no signal that speaking up would lead anywhere useful. Everyone else forgot those moments as soon as they happened. They blended into the rhythm of work, into the background hum of deadlines and alerts. But I remembered them, not with anger, with precision. I remembered the phrasing, the timing, the way decisions were made in rooms I was physically present in, but functionally absent from. I noticed how often flexibility was assigned, not requested, how often my silence was interpreted as consent. At the time, I still believed the system was neutral, that these were just growing pains, that if it ever became too much, I could say something and it would be addressed. That belief is powerful. It keeps you compliant without force. The first small cut didn't hurt. That's the danger of it. It didn't demand attention. It didn't justify the reaction. It just made the next cut easier. And there would be many next ones. By the time I realized something was wrong, it had already become normal. That's how these things work. There's no single moment where you can point and say, this is where it broke. Instead, the abnormal repeats itself until it feels expected. Then it stops registering as a problem at all. My on-call stretches grew longer. What used to be a week turned into 10 days. 10 days quietly became 2 weeks. 14 consecutive days on call stopped raising eyebrows. Not because it was reasonable, but because I handled it without incident. When systems stayed up, no one noticed the cost. When they didn't, I fixed them. Sleep became fragmented. I learned how to rest in pieces, 20 minutes here, an hour there. I kept my phone volume just loud enough to wake me, but not so loud that it startled me. I could fall asleep again in seconds after an alert, like flipping a switch. At the time, I was proud of that ability. I told myself it was mastery. What I didn't say out loud was that my body never fully powered down anymore. Even off call, I slept lightly, half listening for a sound that wasn't there. My shoulders stayed tight. My jaw ached in the mornings. Coffee stopped working, so I drank it anyway out of habit. At work, I maintained the same tone, same responsiveness, same calm. People took that as proof that the arrangement was sustainable. Whenever new schedules were proposed, I noticed a pattern. The same names were protected by explanations. Kids, school, mental health, prior commitments. My name came with none. Not because I had none, but because I'd never made them visible. I built a reputation for not needing accommodation. And reputations, once established, are hard to challenge without seeming inconsistent. On the rare occasions someone asked if the load was too much, I answered honestly, but narrowly. It's busy, I'd say. It's manageable. I'm okay. All technically true, all incomplete. I rationalized my silence in a dozen different ways. I told myself that others had it harder, that this phase wouldn't last, that raising concerns might mark me as less capable, that maybe this was the price of being trusted with critical systems. There was also something else, harder to admit. Being needed felt good, not in a loud way, in a quiet, validating way. The alerts, the reliance, the unspoken expectation that I'd be there, it made me feel essential. And when you've learned early in life that value comes from usefulness, you protect that role, even when it costs you. So when boundaries blurred, I adjusted instead of objecting. I reorganized my life around the work, not the other way around. I stopped planning trips. I answered messages during dinners. I carried my laptop everywhere, like a reflex. No one told me to do that. That's important. The system didn't force me. It simply rewarded the behavior that served it best and ignored the rest. Over time, small comments started landing differently. Robert's built for this kind of pressure. He doesn't really get stressed. If anyone can handle it, he can. They were meant kindly. They landed like verdicts. I stopped being a person experiencing strain and became a benchmark others were measured against. My endurance was no longer mine, it belonged to the narrative. Once, during a retrospective, someone suggested spreading the on-call load more evenly. The idea lingered for a moment, then drifted away when it was pointed out that things were working fine as is. I didn't speak up, that was on me, but silence, repeated often enough, starts to look like agreement. An agreement, even when unintentional, becomes policy. By the time I noticed how tired I was, not just physically but internally, the idea of changing anything felt disruptive, like breaking a contract I'd never signed but had been honoring faithfully. I wasn't being mistreated in an obvious way. No one yelled, no one threatened, no one insulted me. That made it harder to name. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it shows up as an assumption, as a convenience, as the quiet expectation that you will continue to absorb what others won't. And I kept absorbing it because I'd convinced myself that this was just how things worked. That's the moment you should be most careful. It took me a long time to understand that I wasn't just responding to circumstances anymore. I was performing a role. The realization didn't come from a single incident. It came from pattern recognition, from noticing how consistently I was placed in the same position, regardless of context. Reliable, available, uncomplaining, invisible but essential. Once you see the role, you can't unsee it. I noticed it in how meetings were structured. Decisions about workload were discussed abstractly until my name came up. Then they became concrete. Robert can cover that. Robert usually handles these. Let's loop Robert in. There was no malice in it, just efficiency. I also noticed how differently people reacted when others set boundaries. When a colleague declined extra on-call shifts, the response was empathetic. Of course. That makes sense. Thanks for letting us know. When I stayed silent, it was taken as generosity. When I hesitated, it was treated as a delay to be smoothed over. I wasn't expected to say no. I was expected to adapt. That expectation extended beyond scheduling. When incidents happened, I was brought in early, not to lead, but to stabilize. I was the one who translated chaos into order, who wrote the postmortems, who filled in the gaps others didn't have time to document. I did that well, too well, because competence without visibility creates a strange paradox. The better you perform quietly, the less people feel the need to check on you. The system assumes equilibrium because you are absorbing the imbalance. At some point, I realized that my managers didn't actually know what my days looked like. Not really. They saw outputs, uptime, clean reports, resolved tickets. They didn't see the cost. And why would they? I'd never shown it. I'd internalized the idea that professionalism meant containment. That expression of strain was a kind of failure. That if I could just organize myself better, sleep more efficiently, optimize my routines, everything would even out. But it never did. The role I'd been assigned, without discussion, without ceremony, was that of the buffer. The human shock absorber between unreasonable demands and system stability. Buffers don't get thanked when things go right. They only get noticed when they fail. That should have been a warning. Instead, I leaned into the role. I told myself that this was temporary. That once the team scaled, once processes improved, things would rebalance. I told myself a lot of things. There was a moment during a performance review when my manager said, "You're incredibly consistent. We never have to worry about you." He meant it as praise. I nodded. I thanked him. Inside, something tightened. Because being someone no one worries about also means being someone no one protects. I started to see how my identity at work had narrowed. I wasn't Robert anymore. I was a function, a constant, a given. And functions don't get to have limits. They either perform or they fail. The strange thing is, I still didn't feel wronged. Not consciously. I felt tired, yes, drained, a little numb, but not angry. Anger requires a clear target. What I was experiencing was more diffuse, a slow erosion of agency disguised as trust. The role fit me well enough that I didn't question it. That's the most dangerous kind. Because when a role aligns with your coping mechanisms, your need to be useful, your comfort with silence, your pride in endurance, it doesn't feel imposed. It feels earned. I didn't realize that by accepting that role so completely, I was also accepting its eventual care. And that cost would arrive quietly, not as a conflict, not as a confrontation, but as a shift inside me that I couldn't ignore anymore. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where I finally said what I'd been holding back. It was an ordinary weekday, the kind that blurs into every other one when you've been on call too long. I was standing in the office kitchen, waiting for the coffee machine to finish grinding. My phone was in my hand, not because I was checking anything specific, but because I'd stopped setting it down. It felt safer that way. An alert came in, not urgent, not critical, just another system warning that technically could have waited until morning. I acknowledged it automatically, thumb moving before I'd consciously decided to respond. And then, for reasons I still can't fully explain, my hand started shaking, just slightly, enough that I noticed. I stood there, staring at the screen, and realized I was tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix, not physically exhausted. Something deeper, a kind of internal thinning. Like I'd been stretched so long that there was nothing left to stretch. The coffee finished. Someone else walked in and made a joke about the weather. I smiled because that's what I did. I responded to the alert. I went back to my desk. But something had shifted. For the rest of the day, I moved through my tasks with a strange detachment. I still performed well. I still answered messages promptly. But I was watching myself do it, as if from a distance. That night, lying in bed, I didn't fall asleep right away. Not because of alerts, there weren't any, but because my mind wouldn't settle. It kept replaying small moments from the past months. The scheduling meeting, the jokes, the assumptions, the praise felt like a cage. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely rested. Not just off call, but internally at ease, unbraced. That realization landed quietly, but it carried weight. Because once you see that you're no longer recovering, you have to confront what that means. The next morning, I woke up with a tightness in my chest that didn't go away. It wasn't panic. It wasn't pain, just pressure, like my body was holding something it didn't know how to release. I went to work anyway. Of course I did. The shift wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't even about the decision. It was about awareness. A line had been crossed inside me, and I couldn't pretend it hadn't. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I'd been avoiding. What happens if I keep going like this? The answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't catastrophic. It was worse. I saw myself becoming smaller, narrower, more efficient and less alive. I saw my world shrinking to alerts and checklists and recovery times. I saw how easily I could disappear into the role entirely. That night, instead of pushing the thought away, I let it sit. I didn't act on it. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make plans. I just noticed. That was the shift. Not from silence to noise, but from unconscious endurance to conscious choice. I didn't know yet what I would do with that awareness. I only knew that something fundamental had changed. The role no longer felt neutral. The cost was no longer abstract. Once you see the pattern, you can't go back to not seeing it. And once you recognize that your silence is a choice, not an obligation, you start to realize that it can also become something else. After that day, nothing changed on the surface. I kept showing up. I stayed on call. I responded quickly. From the outside, I was the same Robert I'd always been. Calm, capable, unbothered. But internally, the silence had changed shape before my quietness had been automatic. A reflex built from habit and expectation. Now it was deliberate, observant, intentional. I stopped filling the gaps with explanations. I answered questions precisely, not expansively. I let pauses exist in meetings instead of smoothing them over. When decisions were made that affected me, I noted the language used. Who assumed, who asked, who deferred. I wasn't withdrawing, I was paying attention. People didn't notice the shift at first. Why would they? Silence looks the same from the outside, whether it's passive or strategic. If anything, they seemed more comfortable. The system prefers predictability. And I was still predictable in the ways that mattered to it. But internally, I'd begun separating myself from the role. I stopped deriving identity from being the reliable one. I stopped telling myself that endurance was a virtue. That space, small at first, gave me clarity. I began tracking my on-call hours more carefully. Not obsessively, just accurately. I noted how often alerts came in outside the agreed-upon windows. How frequently is temporary coverage extended indefinitely? How often my name appeared in after-hours threads compared to others? None of this was secret. None of it was confrontational. It was just recorded. When someone thanked me for being flexible, I said, "Noted," instead of "no problem." It wasn't sarcastic. It was neutral. The word hung there, unfinished. When asked if I could cover an extra shift, I didn't immediately answer. I said I'd check and get back to them. Sometimes I still said yes, but the delay alone was enough to slightly disrupt the expectation. I noticed how that made people uncomfortable, not angry, just uncertain. The silence created space where certainty used to be. What surprised me most was how quickly others filled that space with assumptions. If I didn't respond right away, they speculated. If I didn't volunteer, they hesitated. My absence from conversations, from instant availability, was suddenly noticeable. That told me something important. I'd never been invisible. I'd been absorbed. And now, by stepping back just a fraction, the shape of the system became clearer. I could see where it leaned on me, how it redistributed pressure when I wasn't immediately there to catch it. No one accused me of anything. No one confronted me. From their perspective, nothing was wrong. From mine, everything was finally visible. I didn't feel powerful. I felt calm. There's a particular kind of calm that comes from detachment. Not indifference, but clarity. From realizing that you don't have to explain yourself to be valid. That you don't have to perform exhaustion to justify boundaries. I still wasn't ready to act. Not yet. But I was done reacting automatically. Silence, once chosen, becomes a mirror. It reflects the assumptions others project onto you. It reveals who benefits from your compliance and who notices when it wavers. And the more I observed, the more I understood that this wasn't about individual behavior. It was about structure, about what gets normalized when someone consistently absorbs more than their share. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me precise. And precision, I would soon learn, is far more disruptive than noise. While everything looked the same on the outside, something else had begun quietly in the background. Preparation, not the dramatic kind. No secret meetings, no whispered plans, just a slow, methodical gathering of reality as it actually was, not as it was assumed to be. What they never noticed was that I had always been a documenter. Long before any of this, I kept notes because it made systems easier to understand. Dates, incident timelines, configuration changes, ownership gaps. It was how I thought. All that changed was why I was paying attention. I began organizing my records differently. Not just technical data, but context. When decisions were made, who was present, what was said versus what was implied. How often temporary responsibilities become permanent without review. I didn't editorialize. I didn't add emotion. I wrote things the way I would want to read them months later. Clean, factual, boring. Boring is powerful. I also started reading more carefully. Policies, HR guidelines, on-call standards that everyone assumed were flexible but were in fact written down. Language around reasonable workload, rest periods, and duty of care. None of it was hidden. It was just ignored because no one expected it to matter. I noticed discrepancies, small ones at first, then patterns. Our official on-call policy capped consecutive days. My actual schedule exceeded it regularly. Incident escalation guidelines recommend rotation. In practice, the same names, mine included, appeared repeatedly because it was simpler. I didn't flag these things. I haven't asked questions yet. I just aligned what I was living with what was written. The gap was not subtle. What they also didn't notice was how much institutional knowledge I carried. Systems no one fully owns anymore. Historical reasons for decisions no one remembered. Workarounds that had become dependencies. I wasn't hoarding this information. I'd always shared it freely. But now I was aware of its weight. Quiet people often end up as archives. I also started taking my health seriously for the first time in a while. Not dramatically, just honestly. I booked a routine checkup, mentioned the sleep disruption, the constant alertness, the chest pressure that hadn't gone away. The doctor listened longer than I expected. Blood work was ordered, notes were taken. Again, nothing alarming, nothing urgent, just data. At work, I remained steady. That was the part everyone saw. What they didn't see was that my steadiness was no longer coming from self-sacrifice. It was coming from the structure. I stopped improvising away problems. If something fell outside the scope, I let it sit until it was formally addressed. If coverage was unclear, I asked who owned it, once. Then I documented the answer. People sometimes seemed surprised by my questions. Not offended, just unaccustomed. Good point, they'd say. Let's follow up. Often they didn't. So I followed up, in writing. Still no confrontation, no accusations, just alignment, reality matching record. The system didn't resist me because I wasn't pushing against it. I was simply refusing to compensate silently for its gaps. That's the part they missed. They thought my value was my endurance, my responsiveness, my calm under pressure. They didn't realize my real leverage was patience, memory, and an unbroken trail of facts. By the time anyone sensed that something was changing, the groundwork was already laid, and I hadn't raised my voice once. The reveal didn't come as a shock. That's the strange part. When the pieces finally aligned, there was no surge of adrenaline, no sense of triumph, just a quiet clarity, like adjusting a lens and realizing the blur had never been the world, it had been the framing. It happened late one evening at my desk at home. No alerts, no messages, just me, my notebook, and a folder of documents I'd been gradually assembling without quite admitting to myself what it would become. I compared timelines, on-call schedules against policy language, incident frequency against staffing plans, my documented hours against what was officially recorded. The mismatch wasn't marginal. It was systemic. For months, longer really, I had been operating outside the bounds of what the company itself defined as reasonable. Not occasionally, consistently, with managerial awareness, even if it was never explicitly acknowledged. That was the moment the story stopped being personal. This wasn't about my resilience or my boundaries or my ability to handle stress. It was about exposure, about risk, about an organization relying on quiet overextension while formally denying it existed. I felt something loosen in my chest as I realized that. Not our relief, responsibility. Because leverage isn't power you wield. It's power you recognize and then decide how carefully to carry. I also saw something else, just as clearly. If anything went wrong, if I burned out publicly, made a mistake under fatigue, or, God forbid, collapsed, the narrative would not protect me. The same silence that had allowed the situation to develop would be used to individualize the failure. It would become about my capacity, my health, my performance, not the structure. That understanding didn't make me angry, it made me deliberate. I scheduled a follow-up appointment with my doctor, not because I was in crisis, but because I wanted documentation. Clear, professional, unemotional notes about sleep deprivation, sustained on-call stress, and early warning signs of burnout. Again, no drama, just record. Then I did something I hadn't done before. I stopped assuming goodwill would fill the gaps. I didn't escalate. I didn't threaten. I didn't hint. I simply ensured that reality, my hours, my responsibilities, my health indicators, existed in places where silence couldn't erase it. HR policies, medical records, timestamp documentation. The reveal for me was realizing that I was no longer unprotected, not because someone had stepped in, but because I had stopped relying on being understood and started relying on being accurate. That's a subtle shift, but it changes everything. There was no celebration that night, no sense of, now they'll see. I closed my notebook, shut down my laptop, and went to bed earlier than usual. For the first time in months, my sleep was heavy. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I finally understood it. And once you understand the system you're in, you're no longer just inside it. You can choose your next move. Clarity doesn't force action, it invites it. Once I understood the position I was actually in, not the one I had assumed, I didn't rush. I let the knowledge sit. I tested it against time, against routine, against my own habits. I wanted to be sure this wasn't just a reaction to exhaustion. It wasn't. The facts didn't change with rest. The pattern held. That's when the decision point appeared, not as a single fork in the road, but as a set of options laid out quietly, one by one. I could keep going as I was, now with better self-awareness, and hope that understanding alone would make it tolerable. I could raise concerns informally, trusting that managers would respond reasonably once the issue was framed clearly. I could escalate formally, knowing that doing so would permanently alter how I was seen. Or I could disengage slowly, reduce my availability, protect my health, and let the system adjust around the absence of my silent compensation. None of these options felt dramatic. None of them felt safe. What surprised me was how little emotion was attached to the choice. Earlier versions of me would have agonized over loyalty, optics, and fairness. Now, those considerations felt secondary to something simpler: sustainability. I asked myself one question and refused to complicate it. Which option leaves me intact, regardless of how others respond? That eliminated the first choice immediately. Continuing as I was, even with awareness, still depended on my body absorbing the cost. The second option, informal conversations, had appeal. It preserved relationships. It aligned with how I'd always operated, but it relied on something I no longer trusted as sufficient: interpretation, tone, memory. I'd learned what happened when clarity lived only in conversation. The third option, formal escalation, was clean but irreversible. It would put everything on record immediately. It would also trigger processes I couldn't control. The fourth option was the quietest and the most revealing. If I stopped compensating, stopped smoothing over gaps, stopped extending myself beyond what was defined, what would happen? Would the system adapt? Would the strain become visible without me naming it? That option didn't require confrontation. It required discipline. I chose a sequence, not a single move. First, I would align my behavior strictly with policy and documented expectations. Nothing more, nothing less. Second, I would protect my health without apology, but also without explanation beyond what was required. Third, I would let outcomes speak before I added commentary. This wasn't avoidance, it was integrity. Once I made that decision, something settled in me. The low-level tension I'd been carrying eased. Not because the situation improved, but because I'd stopped negotiating against myself. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't mark the day. There was no declaration. But internally, the line was drawn. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be the invisible buffer. I would be present, precise, and finite. That choice changed the trajectory immediately, even though no one else could see it yet. And that was the point. The shift didn't announce itself. It never does. From the outside, my behavior still looked cooperative, professional, calm. I didn't refuse work. I didn't withdraw from the team. I simply stopped extending myself past what was defined, and I did it consistently. That consistency mattered. When on-call schedules were published, I checked them against policy and responded in writing when they exceeded limits. Not emotionally, not defensively, just factually. This appears to exceed the consecutive day cap outlined here. Can we confirm rotation coverage for these dates? No accusations, no subtext. Sometimes the response was quick. Sometimes it wasn't. When it wasn't, I didn't fill the silence anymore. I let it exist. I also stopped responding instantly to after-hours messages unless they met escalation criteria. That was harder than it sounds. I had trained myself, trained them to expect immediacy. Pulling that back felt almost like breaking a promise, even though no promise had ever been made. The first few times, someone else picked up the alert. There was confusion, a bit of scrambling. Nothing broke, but the effort became visible. That visibility was new. I continued documenting everything. Not obsessively, not dramatically, just accurately. When coverage was unclear, I asked once. When responsibilities expanded, I requested confirmation in writing. When conversations happened verbally, I followed up with a brief summary email. People began to adjust their language around me. Requests became questions again. Assumptions softened into check-ins. Are you available? Replaced. Can you take this? No one acknowledged the change directly. They just adapted. At the same time, I finalized my medical documentation. The follow-up appointment confirmed what I already knew: sustained sleep disruption, elevated stress markers, and early signs of burnout. The language was measured, professional, undeniable. I didn't share it yet. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about sequencing. I wanted the record to exist before the narrative formed. The system, deprived of my silent compensation, began to reveal its stress points. Coverage gaps became discussion items. Workload imbalance surfaced in metrics. Managers started asking broader questions, not about me, but about sustainability. I watched all of it quietly, not with satisfaction, with clarity. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from alignment, from knowing that your actions match your values and your limits. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next alert with my whole body. I was present, but no longer porous. What no one noticed yet was how little margin remained, how dependent certain processes still were on assumptions that no longer held. They were adjusting, but slowly, and time was no longer on their side, because while they were recalibrating workflows, my body was sending clearer signals. The chest pressure returned more often, concentration dipped, recovery took longer. I knew what was coming before anyone else did, not because I was predicting failure, but because I'd stopped absorbing it. The collapse, when it happened, wouldn't be dramatic. It would be procedural, documented, inevitable given the record. And when it did, the story would no longer belong to interpretation. It would belong to evidence. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They arrived as friction, small delays, missed handoffs. Questions that used to resolve themselves are suddenly landing in meetings instead of my inbox. At first, people treated it as a temporary adjustment period. A few rough edges as responsibilities are redistributed. Nothing alarming, nothing worth escalating. But the system had grown accustomed to a certain shape, and now that shape was changing. Incidents that would have been quietly contained began to spill into visibility. Not catastrophically, just enough to require coordination, to require explanation, to require time. I was still involved, but differently. I responded within scope. I documented, I escalated appropriately. I no longer smoothed outcomes behind the scenes. That difference was subtle, but it changed the rhythm of everything. Managers started asking why certain alerts weren't being resolved as quickly as before, why coverage felt thinner, why were escalation bridges fuller. No one asked me directly. Instead, they asked the system. And the system answered with data. On-call metrics showed uneven load distribution. Incident logs revealed patterns that had previously been masked by my availability. The same names appeared repeatedly in historical data, mine among them. That history couldn't be rewritten. I noticed the tone of conversation shift, not toward blame, but toward concern. People started using words like sustainability and risk exposure. Staffing plans were revisited. Rotation models were discussed seriously for the first time. All of this happened without me saying a word about myself. That was important because it made the issue structural, not personal. At the same time, my health continued to decline, quietly, predictably. I followed my doctor's guidance, reduced caffeine, prioritized rest. But the recovery wasn't linear. The damage had already been accumulating. One afternoon during a routine incident review, I felt lightheaded. Not enough to panic, just enough to notice. I finished the meeting. I documented the follow-ups. I closed my laptop. Later that evening, at home, I wrote a single sentence in my notebook. This is no longer sustainable. No adjectives, no emotion, just a fact. The next few days were a blur of normalcy. Work continued, meetings happened, people adjusted. And then, during another on-call shift, day 14, again, it happened. I didn't feel it coming. One moment, I was standing, reading an alert summary. Next, the room tilted. Sound dropped away. My legs gave out before I had time to interpret what was happening. I woke up on the floor, disoriented, with concerned faces above me. Someone had called emergency services. Someone else was holding my phone, still lit with the alert I hadn't acknowledged. The irony wasn't lost on me. At the hospital, tests were run. Vitals stabilized. The conclusion was clear and unemotional. Exhaustion, compounded by prolonged stress and sleep deprivation. Documented, recorded, time-stamped. When HR contacted me a few days later, it wasn't to ask how I was, it was to understand what had happened. And that's when the consequences truly began. HR framed the initial conversation as a concern. They always do. The email was carefully worded, supportive tone, neutral language, and invitation to talk through recent events. No assumptions, no admissions, just process. By the time I sat in the meeting, video on, posture straight, voice steady, the shape of what was happening was already clear to me. Concern had a direction, and it wasn't aimed at the system. They asked about my health first, how I was feeling, whether I was following medical advice. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I stuck to facts, dates, symptoms, doctor's notes. Then the questions shifted. Had I felt overwhelmed recently? Did I believe I was able to perform the essential functions of my role? Had I communicated any limitations to my manager? There it was, the quiet reframing. My health wasn't being treated as context. It was being evaluated as a variable in my performance. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I provided documentation, on-call schedules, policy excerpts, time logs, medical records. I watched the energy in the room change, not dramatically, but unmistakably. What had started as a one-sided inquiry began to widen. The timeline no longer fits neatly into a personal narrative. HR asked for time to review everything. In the days that followed, I could feel the panic ripple outward, not from individuals, but from the structure itself. Meetings multiplied, legal was looped in, language in emails became more careful. Phrases like industry standard and reasonable expectations appeared more frequently. Someone suggested retroactively adjusting schedules. Another proposed wellness initiative. A third asked whether we should revisit communication norms. It was all well-intentioned. It was all too late, because none of it changed the record. None of it erased the fact that the system had functioned by relying on unspoken overextension, and only questioned it once the cost became undeniable. I wasn't angry during this period. I was tired. Deeply, cleanly tired. I followed instructions, attended meetings, provided clarifications when asked. I didn't editorialize. I didn't accuse. I didn't need to. The system was now confronting itself. What I noticed most was the shift in how people spoke to me. The casual familiarity was gone. In its place was caution, distance, the awareness that every interaction now existed in a context larger than intention. No one could fix this with a conversation anymore. The narrative had escaped control. My health report, the one meant to explain a collapse, had become a performance issue overnight. Not because anyone said it outright, but because the organization didn't have a better framework for understanding it. And once that happens, trust changes shape. I realized then that regardless of outcome, accommodation, leave, role change, there was no returning to who I had been in that environment. Not because I had changed, but because the system had revealed what it did when quiet endurance stopped being quiet. And systems, once exposed, don't forget. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, just a scheduled meeting with an agenda attached. HR, my manager, a representative from legal. All faces are neutral, all words measured. This was the point where traditionally someone is expected to defend themselves, to justify, to explain intent. I didn't. I listened. They spoke about concern for my well-being, about the need to assess role fit, about ensuring business continuity. The language was careful, almost clinical. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly and without emphasis. I clarified timelines. I confirmed documentation. I asked one question at a time. I didn't challenge motives. I didn't speculate. I didn't raise my voice. What I did do was refuse to personalize what was structural. When asked whether I believed I could continue in my role as before, I answered honestly, no, not under the same conditions. That was it. No elaboration. No apology. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but recalibrating. They adjusted their approach after that. The conversation shifted from evaluation to negotiation. Accommodations were proposed, reduced on call, temporary coverage, a phased return, all things that months earlier would have changed everything. Now, they felt procedural. I acknowledged them. I didn't rush to accept. I explained calmly that my trust in informal adjustments was limited given the history, that any path forward would need to be clearly defined, documented, and sustainable. No accusation, just boundary. I could see the realization land, not emotionally, but legally. This wasn't about whether they cared, it was about whether the structure could support what it claimed to value. The meeting ended without resolution. That too was telling. In the days that followed, options crystallized. Leave, role adjustment, separation of terms, each presented carefully, neutrally. I took time to consider them. What struck me most was how different this felt from earlier interactions. There was no assumption now, no casual expectation that I would adapt. Every proposal required my consent. That was the quiet reversal. I hadn't demanded power. I had simply stopped giving mine away. When I eventually made my choice, I communicated it the same way I'd communicated everything else in this process. Clearly, calmly, in writing. No speeches, no bitterness, just alignment. And that alignment closed the chapter more cleanly than any confrontation ever could. I don't work there anymore. That sentence used to feel heavier when I practiced it in my head, like it would carry loss or anger or regret. When it finally became true, it felt accurate, like stating the weather. I took a structured exit. Clear terms, mutual understanding, no scorched earth, no heroic resignation. Just a clean separation that reflected reality more honestly than the role ever had. For a while afterward, I did very little. I slept. Properly. Deeply. Not the fractured kind that leaves you more tired than when you started, but the kind where you wake up and your body feels like it belongs to you again. I walked without headphones. Cooked simple meals. Let my nervous system relearn what no alert coming actually meant. That part took longer than I expected. I'd underestimated how much of myself had been organized around anticipation, around readiness, around being needed. Without that constant pull, there was space, and space can feel uncomfortable when you're not used to it. But slowly, it stopped feeling empty and started feeling intentional. I eventually returned to work, but differently. Smaller team, explicit boundaries. On-call is defined, limited, and shared. Expectations written down before they were lived. I'm still reliable. That didn't change. I still care about doing good work. I still show up when things matter. What changed is that I no longer confuse endurance with worth. I speak earlier now, not loudly, not emotionally, but clearly. I ask questions that make assumptions visible. I treat silence as a tool, not a default. And when something feels unsustainable, I name it while it's still small enough to be addressed. Not because I'm braver, because I'm more precise. I don't harbor bitterness toward the people I worked with. Most of them were operating inside a system they didn't design and didn't know how to question. I was too, for a long time. What I do carry is a different sense of responsibility. Not just to the work, but to myself. To the quiet signals that tell you when something is off, long before it becomes undeniable. The version of me who collapsed wasn't weak. He was overextended, unprotected, and too accustomed to being silent. The version of me now understands that professionalism isn't about how much you can absorb. It's about how clearly you define what you're willing to carry. I don't need to prove anything anymore. Not resilience, not loyalty, not value. Those things don't come from endurance alone. They come from alignment. And alignment, once learned, is something you don't forget. If there's a moral to this story, it isn't don't work hard. And it isn't trust no one. It's quieter than that. Systems don't usually break people by being cruel. They break them by being efficient, by quietly rewarding the behaviors that keep things running smoothly in the short term, even when those behaviors are unsustainable for the person performing them. For a long time, I thought my silence was neutral, professional, mature. I thought I was choosing peace over conflict. What I didn't see was that silence, repeated often enough, becomes part of the system. It teaches people what they can assume, what they don't have to check. When my body finally forced the issue, it wasn't betraying me. It was telling the truth I'd been editing out. The most unsettling part of this experience wasn't the collapse, or the HR investigation, or even the way my health became a performance metric overnight. It was realizing how easily that reframing happened and how normal it felt to everyone involved. No one set out to harm me, and that's exactly why it worked for so long. Quiet people often believe that if something becomes serious enough, someone will notice, that fairness will kick in, that the system will self-correct once the cost is clear. Sometimes it does. Often it doesn't until there's documentation. That's not cynicism, it's mechanics. What protected me in the end wasn't confrontation or outrage. It was accurate. Records. Clear alignment between policy and reality. The decision to stop compensating silently for gaps that weren't mine to fill. And here's the part I want to be careful with. This isn't about becoming colder or more suspicious or less generous. It's about understanding that generosity without boundaries isn't generosity. It's erosion. You can be kind and still be finite. You can be reliable and still be protected. You can care deeply about your work without sacrificing your health to prove it. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about not disappearing. If you're someone who's always fine, always flexible, always the one who picks up the slack, I hope this story gives you a moment to pause. Not in fear, but in clarity. Ask yourself, if I stopped compensating, what would actually break? The answer might tell you more than any performance review ever will. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your perspective. Not just agreement, but experience. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that being the quiet one came with a hidden cost? I'll be reading the comments.